Right. Okay. Right. So this is video B of our discussion on the standards, right? So we were previously discussing the fact that there should be a direct interaction with the board that should exist for the chief audit executive, right? And there are certain other responsibilities, obviously, according to standard 1112, which the chief audit executive have to perform, right, or is expected to perform. So this of course is going to be part and parcel of the roles, and in fact these roles, they are not allowed for the chief audit executive to perform. Why? Because they go beyond internal auditing. So if ever the chief audit executive is to perform some of those responsibilities outside of internal auditing, all right, there are two things that should happen. It's either there should be safeguards that should be in place to what? To limit impairments, independency, and objectivity. Why are we saying so? Because some of those roles may go outside. I mean, so may result in your independency or even sometimes objectivity being impaired, right? So, for example, you hear that maybe the internal auditor participated in compiling of a study guide for the internal audit division at the University of South Africa, for example, right? Compiling of a study guide, it's not part of your internal auditing responsibility. It's something beyond just your internal audit, job or responsibilities in that respect, unless otherwise you're a lecturer, right? So, but if you're in the profession, in practice rather, it's a different thing altogether. So there ought to be some form of safeguards to limit impairments, right? Then there's something called individual objectivity. Now, individual objectivity, it like I said, each one of the internal auditors ought to have an impartial or unbiased mental attitude to avoid conflict of interest, right? So it tallies back to the principle of objectivity that we saw in the IIA Code of Ethics earlier, right? So, but now I want us to look at instances that causes or that may result in the impairment of either independency or objectivity. So number one, impairment of independency happens if, for example, there is restricted access to records, personnel, or physical assets of the entity. Impairment of independency and objectivity happens if there is personal conflict of interest in existence. It also happens if there is scope limitations, right? Scope limitations. Also, if there's resource limitations in terms of funding or resources, capacity itself of the internal audit as a division. If it is limited, or if there's any forms of shortcomings in that respect, that would result in the impairment of independency as well as objectivity for the internal audit division. So sometimes you might, those are some of the possible violations you may pick up in the, in the discussion of violations of the IIA code. I'm going to try and show you maybe one here, just so that it can make more practical sense, right? Don't think on this one we had such an example, but yeah, no, on this one there was no such an example. I was trying to see if I can find something to do with scope limitations, but in this one it was different. The questions, even when you look at them, like for instance, the first one, the chief audit executive for a very small internal audit department has been requested by management to perform an audit of an extremely complex area in which neither the chief audit executive nor any of the internal auditors have the necessary expertise. Okay, now that's a typical example right there. Now we have scope limitations there. Not scope limitations, resource limitations.
Resource
What do I mean resource limitations? We don't have people that are competent in that area to perform that audit. That's a resource limitation right there. However, the nature of the proposed audit engagement falls within our scope. So yes, the scope allows us to perform that audit, but then even if it is within our scope, but we have resource limitations, what do we do? So there are safeguards when there are, you know, some of those things like that. So there are other considerations that we need to, that the chief audit executive has to consider, you know, in those circumstances like that. Now, so let me do this. However, the nature of the proposed audit engagement falls within the scope of the approved internal audit activities. Since management has requested that the audit engagement should be conducted in the near future due to a high level of risk involved, the chief audit executive accepts the audit engagement and begins immediately. Right? Do you see that we have a problem there?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So is there any IPPF violations that you can see there? In this one? Hello?
I can hear you. I'm just reading again.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Right. So clearly there is an IPPF violation right there. Wow. Okay. How do we know there's an IPPF violation? And what IPPF has been violated? There are two. Number one is the Code of Ethics Principle of Competence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And number two, the IPPF standards, independence and objectivity. So look at this with the first one, right? Competency issues, which has to do with the Code of Ethics. So it's a principle that's been violated there. Why? Lack of expertise necessary to conduct the audit in the complex area within the organization. They are lacking competence, but yet they are accepting the audit engagement. And they even studied immediately, but they don't have the expertise to do this job. So that's violating a principle that, or principle of the code competency, which states that we shall only conduct those internal audit engagements for which we have the necessary skills, knowledge, and experience in. In this case, none of these people in the internal audit activity have the skill, the knowledge, and neither the experience. So it's a violation of this principle of competency. Then another thing we can see, despite that it falls within the scope, right? It falls, yes, within the scope because it's documented in the internal audit chart. That's the only reason why they are saying to you, it falls within the scope of approved internal audit activities. Yeah, so the approved internal audit activities, where do we see them? In the internal audit charter. Right. But then there's a violation of the standards here. There's lack of due professional care from the chief audit executive side. Again, not only this, again, I'm seeing an impairment of objectivity. Do you see there? Yes, independence might not be affected, but I'm seeing impairment of objectivity in particular. Why am I saying there's an impairment of objectivity? Because they are incapacitated. So if you are incapacitated, how would you be able to achieve the objective? The objective may not be achieved here because, all right, look at this. How do we see this? How do we know this, rather? Okay, let's check this out. So how do we know that they are incapacitated and there are limitations? If we, okay, let me take you back to the study guide. I wanted to just show you something. Right. How do we know that there are scope limitations? Right. Look at this. Right. There is an impairment of objectivity, to be precise. Why? Why are we saying that there's an impairment of objectivity? Because there is what is it? Resource limitations right there. Right? But in this case, not in terms of funding, but in terms of lacking people with capacity to perform that particular assignment. See. So that's a resource limitation that is within the internal audit division. So what should the chief audit executive have done? All right. So some of these things that you see that I've put where I'm saying lack of expertise necessary to conduct an audit in the complex area within the organization, it's part of the explanation of the violation. Where I'm saying lack of due professional care and all that, part of that. Then the recommendation for this. Here's the recommendation for this, right? So this A that you see there, I was explaining the IPPF that's been violated and everything. So for instance, the recommendation now, it can be something like, for instance, such that the chief audit executive should refrain from proceeding with the audit assignment. And in this instant, consider outsourcing the service for this audit engagement and consent. So that's the first thing that should happen. Refrain from proceeding further with the engagement. That's the first step. Then, for future purposes, the chief audit executive, what should he do? Should ensure that internal audit function undergoes professional development and training within complex audit area as it falls within their internal audit charter in place. It's part of their scope. So if they are not capacitated, it's the chief audit's responsibility, chief audit executive's responsibility to ensure that his team or her team in this case is fully equipped or capacitated to perform what is expected of them. And rule number 1 should be observed, which is to say they shall only engage in those services for which they have the necessary knowledge, necessary skills, necessary experience.
Yeah.
Something like that. Making sense?
Yeah, it is.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, let me take you back because I'm trying to endeavor that we finish with attribute standards today, and maybe the other week we proceed with the other standards, and then we do some couple of questions before moving to another topic altogether. Right, so that was standard 1130. Now, standard 1200 deals with something else called proficiency and due professional care. Now, when you're talking of proficiency, you're talking of 3 things. Proficiency of internal auditor is described by the knowledge of the subject area that they possess, the skills that is required if they meet them, the experience level if they have the experience level expected. It means that the internal auditor is proficient. So proficiency is described in those 3 areas. If there's auditors got skills required, experience level expected, and the knowledge of the subject area in question. If you have that, it means you are proficient. Due professional care. Number 1, you are expected to maintain professionalism, diligence, communication, and interaction with various role players. That's what describes professionalism. If I take you to page 111 of this study guide, it describes due professional care, what it is. So I'm going to quickly take you to page 111 in the study guide, just for this explanation of due professional care. Okay. Let's see, page 111. Okay, just bear with me a bit. We're almost there. Here it is. To be able to comply with the requirements of due professional care, right? In practice, an internal auditor should possess the following personal characteristics: have inquisitive awareness of the new developments. What does it mean? Inquisitive awareness of new development. It means you should have insight into technological influences on the applicable disciplines, together with the interest in learning more about the matters in which he or she is not proficient or new developments. So you must have inquisitive awareness of new developments. So it's one of the recommendations I would have given to the chief audit executive in that scenario we're looking at in October, November past paper, right? Good interpersonal relations, meaning to say you're able to get to get along well with everybody. Diligent and patient. So when you request for information, be patient, exercise patience, right? Where necessary, it's very important. And also be objective and confident in what you're doing, right? So they should have the courage to and of their convictions. They should not hesitate to criticize justly or disclose the truth. That's objectivity and confidence. And you should always be practical in our approach, right? We should also exercise professionalism, meaning to say we are able to comply, maintain, and adhere to high professional calling and ethical code that governs the profession of internal auditing, right? And independency and sound judgment is also another important aspect that we need to observe. And lastly, integrity. So all of this, it's describing what you call it? It's describing due professional care. Yeah, it's describing due professional care. Very important. Right. Let's go back. Let's go back to where we were. Hey, I had moved a couple of miles away, right? So we were talking about, okay, there we go. So I was explaining what proficiency is and also what due professional care entails, right? And then, so notice that the chief audit executive must obtain competent advice and assistance if the internal auditors lack the knowledge, the skills, and other competencies needed to perform all or part of the engagement. That's part of the recommendations I could have given to the, who's this one? To the chief audit executive in that scenario. And also internal auditors must have sufficient knowledge to evaluate the risk of fraud and the manner in which it is managed by the organization. But notice, not expected to have the expertise of a person whose primary responsibility is detecting and investigating fraud. Right. That's very important. That's very important. Okay, due professional care. All right, I've already explained this. I'm not going to repeat this because it's pretty much one and the same, similar things. Now, there's something called continuing professional development. It's still part of, competencies, what is it? Proficiency and due professional care. We are supposed and expected to improve our knowledge, our skills, and other competencies through what? Continuing professional development. So it's part of the things that has to take place, in the division, internal audit division, in the organization. Now, to touch on that, I'll take you now to the last standard, which is standard 1300, which is on quality assurance and improvement program. I'm going to summarize this for you. Now, a quality assurance and improvement program, it's there to ensure that the internal audit division's work is done according to the IPPF framework. That's number one. And to also ensure that the division itself is improved in terms of their work, their duties, their responsibilities. So there are two types of quality assurance assessment that takes place. There's what we call an internal assessment, quality assessment. Then there's what we call an external quality assessment. Now, with an external quality assessment, it happens at least once every 5 years. With the first one, internal, it happens every year, once at least every year. Very, very important. So now, sometimes you might be told that there was no any quality assurance that took place because the internal audit division was lacking funding, for example. You see, so when you get something like that, it means that there's There's no quality assurance taking place, see, at all under those circumstances, right? So here they're explaining external assessments. They happen at least once every 5 years. Internal ones, it's ongoing monitoring of the internal audit activity, periodic self-assessments by other persons within the organization. We have got sufficient knowledge of the internal audit practice. Now there's implementation standards that I would show you where these things are, explained in a greater detail than just what you see here. And okay, let me see if I have it here somewhere so that I can just maybe illustrate some few things for you. Just give me a second to open that document. Yes. So it's not implementation standards, man. It's implementation guidance. Here it is. But implementation guidance is part of the what? Recommended guidance. Let me show it to you. From the IPPF presentation that I was giving you. So implementation guidance is this one. Recommended guidance, implementation guidance. So there's something here that I'd opened just now. Let me just try to, yeah, here it is. Implementation guides. So that's the implementation guidance. It is this one. There, implementation guidance. There's also supplemental guidance. So this is implementation guidance. Notice it's quite a big thing, but it elaborates further on most of those standards there. So like, for instance, let me just maybe illustrate with what we are looking at now, which is on the standard 1300. This one, quality assurance and improvement program. So when you go there, in the implementation guidance, they explain to you in detail. It's almost similar, like the interpretation you have here to what you have in the standards. Let's close this one for now. Yeah, it's almost similar to what you have here, this description, this interpretation. Quality assurance and improvement, yeah, it's one thing here. But where the issue is, where they get to unveil in detail in the implementation guide is where they explain this, where they are saying getting started. So they get to explain to you the steps that takes place and, who is responsible for what, right? Here are the considerations. So they can ask you something about the considerations. Yeah, something like that. You see. So, for instance, internal assessments, external assessments. So these are internal quality assessments, external quality assessments. So, for example, when an internal quality assessment is being done, notice they give you details of what takes place there as compared to what you have in the standards. They're not explaining this in detail. Do you see that?
Yeah.
But when you go to the implementation guidance, notice these are internal assessments, right? And it's explained in a greater detail, right? And they explain what it is, what should be taking place, and all of that. Same story with an external assessments. So they give you details of what takes place during that place. Some questions they can ask you is the communication of the quality assurance improvement program results. How are they supposed to be communicated? What should be contained in the communication? The scope and frequency of both internal and external assessments has to be stated in the result. Qualifications and independence of the assessors or assessment team has to be depicted there. Any conclusions of the assessors stipulated there. Any corrective action plans stipulated in the report. But when you come to the actual, standard that's described here, you don't see that. See, it's limited, some of that information. Yeah, but nonetheless, I'm going to send these details to you. So
this implementation guide. Yeah.
It's important that you have that, right? So I think, but for today, I would leave it here on the IPPF standards, attribute standards. So we leave it here at standard 1300. and then we'll pick it
Okay.
up with the performance standards.
Okay, no problem. And then Saturday, what happened? Risk.
Right. Let me
Angry